The Fair Housing Act of 1968 by Drew Carter. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, government policy and the dislike of black people by white Americans created the ghettos. These ghettos were areas of town for black people to stay so as not to lower the value of white neighborhoods. This is an example of a rundown Harlem ghetto. Since they did not have the resources in these ghettos, they led to higher crime and lower income. Following the Chicago riots of 1919, led by whites against integration, the real estate market felt they had to step in to stop destruction and property loss. These riots went on for 6 days and resulted in 38 deaths. These were a part of the Red Summer of 1919 that was filled with a lot of hate towards the African American community. This is an example of one of the many homes destroyed during these riots. After these riots, lawmakers felt they needed to give in to these rioters. This is what led to redlining, a way the government and real estate companies could segregate communities to the next half century. Districts that contained black people, or had a good chance of it, were considered red and could not get loans from the bank. As you see in this picture, cities would have a lot of space occupied by red. This was the downfall of our country for a long time. The Fair Housing Act began to be introduced midway through the 1960s, and the act had chances to pass in 1966 and 1967, but could not muster enough support. Things were starting to look grim on getting it passed until America experienced a tragedy. The country mourned as it lost a great leader and engineer of change. On April 4th in Memphis, the country lost Martin Luther King Jr. The Fair Housing Act passed in 1968, signed by Lyndon B. Johnson shortly after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. 20 senators switched party lines to pass it through Congress. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination was used by the president to pull at the heartstrings of Americans, and suddenly a lot more people felt we needed change. This was the president signing the bill. The Fair Housing Act contained a few parts. It prohibited racial discrimination in a sale and banned agents from making untrue statements about homes or neighborhoods to steal different races from moving in. This is how the country moved on from separating whites in one neighborhood and blacks in another. Agents at this time were also notorious for not giving info to blacks and cutting deals or showing nicer homes to whites. Fair housing was one of the many reasons for protests in the 60s, as you can tell in this picture. At first, the Housing Act only applied to about 80% of the U.S. housing market. But 2 months later, a Supreme Court case made it official for 100% of the market. This was instrumental in forcing this act nationwide, and the only way we are going to make progress. Still, however, this country is facing many problems in housing. 21 American cities are still hyper-segregated, and this dissimilarity index in suburbs versus downtown still shows heavy segregation. Hypersegregation is defined as a race or ethnic group being segregated in multiple ways, no matter how it is measured. Cities like Detroit, Chicago, Baltimore are all examples. Loss of jobs combined with low-income project housing is part of what led to the concentration of blacks in downtown urban areas. Also, companies are finding new ways to discriminate. Independent studies have shown that white people still get told about more deals, better houses, and offers more often than black. Over the phone, there has also been instances where real estate agents will not try to sell you as hard if you sound non-white. This is a problem that we still need to face as a country, but is a hard one to tackle. One cannot prove this bias, and therefore is hard to enforce, but as a country we can become better at removing these implicit biases. Reverse redlining is also a method in the 21st century. Instead of not giving mortgages in red districts that have black people, they will now give out risky loans with very high interest rates to get money from them and drive them to foreclosure. Redlining was eliminated by different laws and mortgage rules, but reverse redlining is still something the government does not have an answer for. This is another example of ways this country still faces challenges in the housing market post Fair Housing Act. And here's my works cited page. I researched at the U.S. Department for Housing and Urban Development's website. I looked at the Fair Housing Act. I looked at the legacy of the Fair Housing Act on JSTOR. And I looked at the private enforcement of the Fair Housing Act through Yale's Law and Policy Review on JSTOR.